Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this virtual event. I'm Mitchell Kaplan, and on behalf of all of us at Books and Books and the Miami Book Fair, I want to welcome you to this very, very special event this evening. As all of you know, today, and maybe you don't all know, but today is Independent Bookstore Day. I'm wearing my Books and Books t-shirt, and I want to thank everybody out there for supporting independent bookstores all across the country, as well as Books and Books specifically here in Miami. It's been a wonderful day, and I can't think of any better way to cap Independent Bookseller Day than to be presenting two people who have been so remarkably supportive of bookstores across the country. They've been friends of Books and Books from almost all of their books, and they've appeared at the Miami Book Fair as well. And that's Dave Barry and Adam Monsbach. Dave is going to be interviewing Adam because today we're celebrating the publication of Adam's new book. Most of you know Adam as a novelist, a screenwriter. He's also a cultural critic, and he's a humorist. His very big book was a book that came out years ago, and it was truly a phenomenon. It went viral. It was called Go the Fuck to Sleep. I'm sure most all of you know about it. The audiobook was narrated by Samuel L. Jackson and Bryan Cranston, as well as Larry David. They as Adam says, those audiobooks were fucking good as well. Adam is also a novelist. Rage is Back, The End of the Jews, which won the California Book Award, and Angry Black White Boy, which is also taught in over 100 schools and was adapted into a prize-winning play. Adam is also a screenwriter. His debut screenplay was with the Netflix original series called Barry, and it was nominated for an Independent Spirit Award and an NAACP Image Award, which are not easy awards to be nominated for. Adam right now is a New Voices professor. He has been a New Voices professor of fiction at Rutgers University. He was in 2012 Sundance Screenwriting Lab Fellow. His work appears everywhere: the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Believer, the Guardian, the Los Angeles Times. But tonight we're here because he has just published a new memoir in verse. It's called I Had a Brother Once, and it slayed me. It's a remarkable, remarkable memoir that is told in verse. All of us know that remember that book, Go the Fuck to Sleep. Well, he was in the middle of having that book about to come out, and he was in the middle of probably what was the beginning of an incredible career high, because that book was about to reach #1 in the New York Times bestseller list, when all of a sudden he got a phone call from his dad, which basically changed his life at that point. He will talk about all of that in this, but I think what I felt is very much echoed by the writer Daniel Alarcon, who writes about I Had a Brother Once. You've never read a book like this one, with such heart and such grace. Adam Monsbach unpacks a kind of loss most of us will never experience, and build something at once majestic and intimate, a tribute, a totem, a life. To interview Adam, and it may seem a little counterintuitive, but to interview Adam is our very own Dave Barry. Dave and Adam have been friends for so long. They've even co-written along with a wonderful third writer, two books called A Field Guide to the Jewish People, Who They Are, Where They Come From, What to Feed Them, and much more, maybe too much more. And also, for this we left Egypt, a Passover Haggadah for Jews and those who love them. In his own words, Dave Barry has been a professional humorist ever since he discovered that professional humor was a lot easier than working. Dave has been a friend for as long as our bookshop has been open, and in many ways, Books and Books owes a lot to who we are, to Dave and his incredible spirit. And Adam and Dave, I want to welcome you both to the stage right now, and thank you for being part of Independent Bookstore Day and this very special evening.
Cool.
Well, I'm going to leave it to you guys.
Okay.
Go at it.
Well, hey, Adam.
Hey, Dave. Good to see you.
Anyway, good to see you too. I'm going to start us off. And I want to thank Mitchell for that wonderful introduction, and just remind everybody that one of the best ways to celebrate Independent Bookstore Day would be to patronize your independent bookstores. There is no better independent bookstore than Books and Books here all over Miami. Mitchell Kaplan is an amazing entrepreneur, and his store is the literary heart, cultural heart, really, of this town, and we love him for it. As Mitchell said, Adam and I have known each other a while. We co-wrote a couple of books with Alan Zweibel. We've been on many book tours together, which are my favorite book tours I've ever done, because all we do is tell jokes. And a lot of them are at the expense of Alan Zweibel, who's not with us tonight. Probably that's a good thing. As Mitchell said, it probably seems counterintuitive that I would be interviewing Adam tonight, because Adam's already bailing out. Oh, there it is. He's back.
It's Alan's book.
Okay, good. We got a little product placement there. It is counterintuitive that I because I'm supposed to be Mr. Joke Man. But like Mitchell, I was deeply moved by this book, and I have a personal connection with it, which I'll get out now because it may as well come out now. My mother committed suicide, and this book is about a suicide, or it's about other things too, but the heart of it is the suicide of Adam's brother David, and he talks about you have to read the book to see what he does with that and how he responds to it. But it's truly astounding. And I'm going to ask Adam, because it's, as Mitchell said, this is not an ordinary prose book. This is it's written in verse, but not like any verse that I'm used to. I'll let Adam read it some from you for you, so you'll get the feel of it, and then we'll talk about it.
Yeah. Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Mitchell. Thank you, Books and Books. I just want to echo everything that Dave said. Books and Books is really one of my favorite bookstores in the world. And it's an honor to be here. It's an honor to be here on Independent Bookstore Day. It's always a pleasure to be here with Dave, who I'm grateful. When you give Dave a chance to do an event where he's probably going to be less funny than he's ever been, it's a bit of a tough sell. So I appreciate his willingness to join me here today. So I'm going to read a little bit from the book. I'm going to pick up at the moment that I have just found out from my father over the phone that my younger brother David has taken his own life. It's 12:30 at night. Normally I would have been asleep for a long time by this point, but I happen to be awake because I'm DJing. I'm playing records at a bar in Philadelphia where I was living at the time. So I'll just read a couple little pieces that'll hopefully add up to give you a sense of the book. My father's sentence was unrecognizable, a cluster of words spinning in a void. The notion that it was all a mistake flashed through me and fell instantly to ash. No parent would say such a thing about his child, to his child, if there was any hope. And here begins a different kind of struggle on this page, akin to keeping the steering wheel perfectly straight, a struggle not to crane out of this shot, not to add voiceover, not to do the one thing I am trained to, which is make things legible, impose structure and plot, motivation, a frame, a double helix of narrative to snake through the spine, to be the spine. Here I am. Here we are, not 50 feet from the news of my brother's suicide, and already I can feel a tug at the reins. I don't know if naming these things can sap their power or if it constitutes a sacrifice at their altar, an invitation to the impulse I am trying to disperse. What are the rules of this endeavor? Am I supposed to unfold the moments of this night like an origami crane, crease by crease? Is that the penance or the healing, the ritual, a march toward or away from what? Penance for what? If you were making up the ritual as you go, is it a ritual? If the loss is a hole that cannot be filled, is the remainder of your life the ritual? Are rituals supposed to fill the hole or deepen it until you can crawl out the other side? And who am I that I have to ask? My mother's father's parents were the children of famed rabbis. They came here and founded a Jewish community in Burlington, Vermont by paying other Jews to keep the Sabbath, making them whole and a minion by handing out the wages they would have lost in observing the holy day. And here I am, not even 150 years later, acting as if the books my people carried and died for are unknown to me. Here I am, freighted by nothing, reinventing the wheel, reinventing the rack, daring to believe that perhaps you only realize a ritual was one after you complete it. Inscribe the final character. A tear falls on the page, becomes the final period, or some stupid maudlin shit like that. The final moment is what I dwell on most. He is sitting in his Subaru, overlooking nothing, the ass end of a parking lot, the chemicals he will mix into the gas that kills him lying in his lap, knowing he is one breath away, that he could end it all right now, though any of us could really. It is always right now. There are always heights and cars, things to fling yourself off or in front of. There is always a drawer full of knives. I imagine he is crying, but that is only because I would be. Perhaps he is laughing or luxuriating in the sudden, vivid crispness of the world, the miraculous dispersal of cumulonimbus formations in a southwesterly wind, and feeling free at last. Or just as likely, he is stone-faced with determination, so close, just one final push. Perhaps the act was a ritual, a series of gestures rehearsed and enacted with faithful, reverent precision, the implements delicate in his large hands like eyedroppers, carrot peelers. It is all unfathomable. I cannot place myself in him. I'm throwing cliches at the wall. They say a velvet calm descends when people have decided, gathered their supplies, chosen a place, an hour. Their moods lighten and their loved ones think they've turned a corner, which they have, a different corner. But in my head, that's where he always is, sitting in his car with me screaming, "Don't do it," from the backseat like some spirit cursed to be unheard. And my mother's father's parents, the famous rabbi's kids, the minion makers of Burlington, Vermont, they squat atop the glass floor of the distant beyond, shaking their great woolly heads and asking why, of all things, did it have to be gas? The last time the world's greatest drummer ever drummed, I was there. Elvin Ray Jones had been in hospital for 6 months, his liver and kidneys shutting down, avenging past abuse, when Keiko, his wife and manager, my former boss, called me. She had pulled Veen out against the doctor's orders, and they were coming to Oakland to play Yoshi's and needed help. I'd left New York a year before and hadn't traveled with them since. Knew he'd been sick, but little more. When I arrived, I found Veen sitting alone in the dark green room, 40 pounds lighter and already partway somewhere else. He gave me a papery hug and muttered hard shit. Dying, I think he meant. The band was mostly new cats, hastily assembled. The only people who had known him long were Delphio and me. Elvin was barely talking, but Keiko told me that in the hospital he had spoken frequently of John, whose name seldom passed Veen's lips in normal times, the loss too raw despite the years. When reporters asked, Veen fed them platitudes, said John had been an angel sent from heaven. I always took this to mean that Elvin was the demon in their partnership, elemental and propulsive, the churning ocean atop which Coltrane balanced as he searched for God. There was an oxygen tank now, backstage at first, and then as the week unfolded on it, tubes snaking from behind the floor toms into Elvin's nostrils. The audience did not know what to make of what they saw. One night, the doctor who supplied the tank got caught in traffic, and the tip of Veen's right stick came up half an inch short of the golden ride symbol every time he tried to hit it. The fans were in agony, doubled forward in their chairs, willing the wood to find the hammered metal. I heard an old man say, "Let him go home and get some rest," as if Veen had been rousted from the sick bed against his will. But Keiko knew exactly what she was doing. Elvin had allowed her to see him in all his naked fullness, and so when the time came, here he was dying at home on his drum stool. His purpose had never been in doubt. He was on the planet to offer the gift of music to a world that needed all the love and majesty those songs contained. Seldom did a gig pass in all my years backstage with Keiko that she did not tell me as much. Restate this thesis, eyes widening over her cup of tea, bright painted lips pursed as she nodded in somber agreement with herself. His job was to play and hers was to make sure that nothing stopped him, to sweep away impediments and master details, belay danger no matter the source or the toll it took. I saw her throw musicians bodily out of nightclubs when they showed up high on that shit, because nobody high was going to be alone with Keiko's husband ever again. They were heroes to each other, or perhaps figures from one of the Japanese myths she turned into songs for him to play. The monk and his sworn warrior protectress. Elvin's certitude sat at the precise center of him, radiating an electric peace that by the time it reached his four extremities and passed into the bass and hi-hat, snare and toms, and crash and ride became a storm. The very last night, Keiko stood behind him as he played the final song of the first set, arms wrapped around his chest as if he were her mask. The tune was Dear Lord, one of John's. When it was over, Veen sat motionless behind the trap kit while we waited for the room to clear. Delphio and I had to carry him off stage, lift Elvin beneath the armpits and press our hands against his back as he labored to move the same legs that had just powered the pedals, his smell still sharp and clean, his forehead and medallion glistening, and the people didn't need to see that. But this time, as the house lights rose, Veen picked his sticks back up and began to play. The crowd turned, surged back inside, masked before the stage. The sound was thunderous, exalted, the equal of any solo I had ever heard him play, and I had heard hundreds. I wonder if it's possible that what that solo was for Elvin, loosing those two gases and allowing them to become one and opening his lungs, was for my brother.
Thank you. I'm going to start with, I think, the most the cliche question, but it's a question I want to know the answer to, which is, why did you write the book now? Why'd you write it first? Why'd you write it now? You waited. You were, as Mitchell said, on the cusp of having the #1 book in the world. Go the fuck to sleep. Most authors will never see that kind of success. That hit right after this happened to you. You had to deal with that success, which you talk about in the book, and I hope we get to. But then you waited years, and now you've written this. Did you write it for you? Did you write it for us? What's the story behind that?
Yeah, in all of the time that passed between David's death and me finally sitting down and writing this book 8 years later, I never stopped thinking about writing something. I always knew that I had to write something. As writers, this is how we deal and process, and it's a part of our grief and our mourning and our moving on. But I could never figure out how to do it. And I think not being emotionally ready was part of not being able to figure out how to do it. But the thing that always stopped me on a surface level was the form, figuring out the architecture of what the book would be. I don't naturally gravitate or think first of writing poetry. I've always written poetry. My first book ever was a book of poetry, and none of my books since has been a book of poetry. So I thought about the scaffolding that would be required for it to be a novel, even a screenplay, some kind of long essay. And that always stopped me before I started because I couldn't figure out what that schematic looked like. And then 2 years ago, I was asked to participate in an event at SF Jazz. A friend of mine who was the program director asked me to write a piece to perform with a live band. So that took me back to the idea of poetry. I used to perform with live bands all the time. I mean, I still do if you count the Rock Bottom Remainders as a band, I suppose. That put my mind in the mode of poetry because I wanted to write something that would really sing on stage, as poetry sometimes does and prose sometimes does not. Fife from A Tribe Called Quest had recently died, so I wrote a short elegy for him. But really, I spent a week in a jazz club with a bunch of jazz musicians and a bunch of really good poets, many of whom were also really good friends. And I was sort of re-inspired and reinvigorated and sort of remembered that poetry at its best can be a really powerful form and a liberating form because it doesn't require a lot of the scaffolding that in my mind had been stopping me. Poetry allows you to move from scene to scene and idea to idea with a lot more freedom. It doesn't slow you down the way that other forms do. So when I got home from that week, it also would have been the week that my brother turned 40. So I think reconnecting with poetry and the power of that date in combination kind of got me going. And I sat in this room and I just started writing. I wrote the book very quickly. It took me about 3 weeks to write, but it also took me like 8 years and 3 weeks to write. And it kind of all poured out. And I just kind of let it. It was a very weird, intuitive writing process where, I didn't always know why I was writing what I was writing or how it would connect. The piece that I just wrote about Elvin is a good example of that. I somehow sort of knew that it belonged in the book. Obviously, it's about death and mortality, but I didn't know exactly why it belonged until I got to the end of it and wrote those last couple of lines that connected to my brother. And the next line after that in the book is me basically saying, no, I don't accept that. It's not the same thing. Because another thing I'm doing in the book is putting forth and often just as quickly denying or rejecting these ideas, these theses, these different narratives around my brother. So there was a lot that poured out of me that I'd known and that I'd said. And there was other stuff that I was really just figuring out in the process of writing it, like connections I had not yet made, thoughts that had not yet connected for me, and probably never would have had I not committed to the process of trying to put it down on the page. So it was kind of an insane writing process. I did very little else during those 3 weeks. I was not a great parent. Arguably, I'm never a great parent, but I was a worse parent during those 3 weeks. But yeah, that's how I wrote the book, and that's when I wrote the book.
Well, I know you wrote it fast. I read it fast. As soon as I picked it up, that was it, and I didn't set it down until I finished reading it. I want to talk a little bit about David. First of all, the line that made me gasp, it was so good, was when you talked about, you connected your Jewish forebears with the way he chose to kill himself. And you say David was a scientist, and he obviously planned it out very carefully. He bought the chemicals. He knew what he was going to do. He knew exactly how he was going to do it. He did it in a very clean, neat, efficient, scientific way. But you say also that it was a complete shock, that you did not see this coming, that nobody saw this coming, that you mentioned as possible reasons for it, depression. You said, well, you say he was depressive, but you didn't expect it to happen. Can you talk about that, about not knowing? Because you to the end of the book, stick to that. You don't know. You can't really know. Why did he do it?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. David's depression was something he kept very closely guarded and was very secretive about. He did not want people to know. There was clearly a lot of shame around it. His wife knew, but she was sort of sworn to secrecy. In the final months of his life, my parents knew, but he was telling his wife, like, look, anybody that you tell, I will never speak to again. And it's interesting because depression is not unusual. It's not unusual, period, and it's certainly not unusual in our family. Grandparents on both sides, various cousins and uncles and aunts. There's a lot of depression, but I think paradoxically, what that has done in our family, not anymore, obviously, but I think it conditioned us to think that depression is something you live with rather than something that could, in fact, kill you. And in a way, David's unwillingness, he was less willing to tell his story than he was to end his story, which is a thing that is still, very painful and confusing. And a lot of the book is me grappling with trying to get inside the mind of someone whose mind works fundamentally differently than mine, because I'm lucky. I'm not depressed. I cannot really understand. And it seems, unnatural in a way that nothing else does. Like I can't actually think of anything else in the world that I would deem unnatural. The way that, to me, ending your own life does. And I'm lucky to feel that way. And I understand that for a lot of people, it makes perfect sense. And I've spoken to people for whom it makes perfect sense. But for me, the idea that you would fight to die in the same way that most of us sort of fight to live continues to be a very confusing thing. And, a lot of the book is me struggling with trying to understand or decide that I'm okay not understanding the various paradoxes that characterize the decision and the life that my brother led. Like, my cousin and I went to his house a little bit after he died to just kind of housekeep and gather things up. His wife did not want to go there. And among other things, we found that he had ordered this very expensive skateboard that had not arrived at his house yet. So and there was a part of me at that moment that wanted, it almost turned into a bad TV show. Like, aha, something's not adding up here, right? But no, it's like there was a part of him that was planning to live and skateboard, and there was another part of him that, as you say, was planning meticulously to die. And that's not a paradox that you can resolve. It's just a paradox that you just have to hold it. You just have to hold the paradox, and that's all you can really do with it.
You say you describe your brother as kind of a quirky guy. I'm putting it mildly. Like, for example, you say he removed his own braces because he didn't want to wear braces. He didn't care if his teeth were messed up. Yeah. And you say you at one point say you think he might have had Asperger's. You suggest that anyway. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Did he? Was he a weird person, or was he? What? Tell us about your brother more.
Yeah. Fundamentally, my brother was a very gentle and kind and caring and empathetic guy. The kind of guy who spent his free time volunteering at a hospital as a translator, had a real sense of community, used to shovel the neighbor's snow and refused to be paid for it and things like that. But yeah, there were also, he was also a guy who was quirky. And there were moments when it felt to me like the quirks were sort of, they didn't fully add up to a personality. They were sort of in place of a fully developed personality. But Dave, the thing is, the way that suicide puts an end to suicide makes you look back at everything you thought you knew about a person and reconsider and doubt it. So it's in a way, it's like, okay, he was hard to have a like emotional conversation with. Like questions that would normally sort of elicit an emotional response often would not, right? Like you might ask him a question about his marriage and he might answer with statistics about crime in Rio, and it wouldn't always complete. And it's like, is that the whole, but it's, and, and at the time throughout those years, I often was like, yeah, something isn't, yeah, maybe there's a neurological like reason for some of this. But also now in retrospect, I also say, well, maybe that avoidance of emotion was because tapping into any kind of emotion was too hard because he was trying to keep this great secret at bay, and it's weird. Like every story that I have about him, there's now a kind of different ending that I have to decide whether I want to end the story on that note. Like for years, I told the story about him taking his braces off because it's a funny, weird story about a quirky, determined kid. His college essay was about taking his braces off, right? And he did a really good job. He sterilized all the equipment. Even his orthodontist sort of congratulated him on the work, But now it's like when I tell that story, I sort of every time I think, do I just leave it at that, or do I add my own sort of commentary that this was, the first time that he reclaimed sovereignty over his body, but it wouldn't be the last time. Like I never know whether I should go there. In my mind, I go there in the book, but I feel bad every time I do it. And yet it's kind of what I have, is like, yeah, looking at photographs, right? Like photographs look different now. They're the same photographs, but like he used to be smiling in the photograph. Now maybe he's not. Now maybe the smile is pasted on, maybe he's not looking at the camera. Maybe he's staring past it. All of these ways, like when a life ends that way, it sort of ripples backward through the life in ways that are complicated. Yeah.
When my mom killed herself, I was shocked, but I was not surprised. She also suffered from depression, and she lived, I think, a wonderful life. She had many friends. She was 70 years old, but after my father died, her depression got worse and worse, and we all tried to help her without knowing anything about what she was going through. But when she did it, when she took her life, I thought that was right. She had talked about it. She wanted to do it. We dealt with it many times, but we kind of thought she wasn't going to ever really carry it out, but she did. And my immediate reaction, and it sort of still is my feeling, was, although I wish she hadn't done it and I would have tried to stop her from doing it, I understand why she did it. And I think for her, it was the right decision. Do you feel that way about David? Are you angry at him? I sense sometimes, you like everything in this wonderfully nuanced poem, you never come right all the way down on, black and white. This is right. This is wrong. This is how this is what happened. Are you angry at him?
No, I'm not. And it's interesting because that's always a question, like around suicide is whether you're angry at the person. No, I don't feel angry. I mean, if nothing else, I understand the level of pain and suffering that a person has to be going through to make the decision to kill themselves. So I'm not angry. The times in the book when the anger comes up are around sort of question. I mean, it sounds funny to say, but like questions of narrative. Like, as I struggle with whether I should try to tell his story, my authority in telling his story, the paradoxes that prevent me from telling his story, the fact that the fear that the more times you tell a story, you keep trotting that same path and it like becomes the story. And I know it's not the story. It's just my version of the story. And I don't want it to kind of solidify into the story. I don't want to get to a point where I just have a series of talking points that I trot out and I never have to think past them. So a lot of the book is me trying to juggle all of those things. And the time that comes to mind first when you say that there's anger in the book is when I'm sort of, I find myself in the admittedly weird position of like arguing with his own note, the note that he left behind for us, in which he essentially says that he always thought that he should be dead. And I find myself like debating that with him, like questioning his authority, questioning his reliability as a narrator. Remembering times when that seems like it couldn't be true, remembering our childhood. There's an anger in me, I guess, in that I do think that there are things that he could have done that he didn't do, right? Like there's a way in which his path toward this irreversible decision that for him seems like it was inevitable on some level. It's a very narrow path. Like, in the book, I sort of like toss off these things that he didn't go to the rainforests of Peru and try ayahuasca, which might have rewired his brain, and it's like, but who am I to say, right? Like,
yeah.
I mean, the facts are that he was young and he did have a life in front of him, and there do seem like there were paths not taken, and I part of me does, think about the chestnut of like suicide as a permanent solution to a temporary problem and all of that kind of thing. So, there is a part of me that is not at peace with it, is not like this was the right thing for him to do and it was inevitable. I mean, they tell you that if somebody is committed to killing themselves, you can't stop them by removing the means, the access. You take away the knife, they're going to use a gun, etc. But there is that part of me that thinks, well, there is a point before the point of no return. What if there had been different things that had happened at those points, at in the pre-decision era, but no, I mean, I don't usually feel angry. It's in there somewhere, but it's not the daily experience that I have. Luckily for me, because I think that would be shitty to feel that.
Yeah. Your brother David never had children, and one of the things that struck me in the book is very quickly after you learn of his suicide, you say to your partner, "We have to have another baby." You talk about that?
I remember that very well, because even as I was saying it, I knew that it was like an outlandish thought to be having. I mean, first of all, my partner at the time, who is no longer my partner, we were in no shape to be having any more children whatsoever. I mean, that relationship was on its last legs. And only the child that we had was keeping me trying to make it work. But there was an emotional truth to it at the time. Like the only thing that was gonna potentially keep the family together or like keep us able to continue on in the aftermath of this shocking death was like more new life. I don't know. And I really did say it like minutes after breaking the news to her. I mean, what a weird thing to think, right? What a weird.
That's what I thought.
Yeah. No, it really was. It really was.
And you did ultimately, not with that partner, have two more babies.
I did go ahead and have two more children.
Yeah. So many great, I don't want to say lines, but passages. One of them that really got me, and you've been sort of touching on it as we go, is this fear you have of allowing things to become too pat in your mind, too literary, too writer's workshop-y, too here's how I write about it, now I'm done with it. Yeah, and that becomes what it is. The line that really got me, where you say that is, you're talking about processing grief, as we say, and you say, how long before we confuse happiness with distance, closure with being unable to remember. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah.
I mean, what I'm getting there is, and I feel that we all do this. You're like, it's almost, you're saying it's wrong to let go of the grief and the pain. It's just, it's too easy, and we should, but it's almost unavoidable. Anyway, I'm not saying it as well as you did. So.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny. Like, one of the ideas that I somehow got in my head in the immediate aftermath of David's death, again, as I'm leading this extremely weird double life where I'm like more public than I've ever been, and sort of constantly publicly performing like joy and surprise and like success and happiness, while privately just utterly in shock, and toggling between these states like dozens of times a day as I'm doing all of this media and stuff or go the fuck to sleep. One of the ideas I somehow got in my mind was the idea that, like, if I didn't properly grieve, like fully grieve, then the grief was going to, like, if I didn't vanquish the grief now, it was going to slink off somewhere to some cave and, like, you know, do a bunch of push-ups and like drink a bunch of protein shakes and come back like bigger and stronger and unconquerable. And this, you know, as I contemplated my own lack of ritual and the fact that, you know, as an extremely secular Jewish person, I'm not, you know, I didn't have a rabbi to go to. We sort of went through the paces of sitting Shiva and of doing these things, but I didn't have like a bedrock of ritual to fall back against. So the fear that I wasn't grieving properly or completely, and thus was like fucking over my future self, was very present in my mind. And, you know, then you begin to wonder if you're just falling back on distance and it's just time that is allowing you to feel like you've healed, but you're really just sort of farther from being able to access the grief, and the two aren't the same thing. And yeah, there's a funny dichotomy, a funny paradox between wanting to heal, wanting to feel better, wanting to have closure and catharsis, and knowing that once you abandon your ability to access the grief, there's a feeling almost of betrayal, you know, like what does it mean? And I felt that even in the immediate aftermath, like, you know, because the message that a suicide is sending, among others, is that the person, you know, again, particularly someone as like loving and caring as my brother, there's really the belief that they won't be missed, the belief that everybody will get over it. And I remember constantly thinking, like, am I proving him right by 2 weeks after he dies, sitting here chatting it up on the Today Show with fucking Kathy Lee Gifford? Is this actually proof that everything he said is right, that we are all moving on? Am I doing this so my family can see that life continues, and for my own selfish reasons of wanting this book to succeed? Or is this actually, like, you know, yeah, it's complicated. So yeah, I mean, that's another idea that I sort of grapple with in the book without ever finding a proper.
Because there isn't one. I mean,
yeah.
My mother killed herself over 30 years ago. And what I told you about, well, I still think it was, you know, I understood. I still sometimes say to myself, am I saying that because it's true, or because that's just easier for me to process it that way, to say, okay, she got what she wanted and it was the rational decision. And I still don't know the answer, and I never will. While you're going through that with Go the Fuck to Sleep, huge success, you're out. And for those of the listening and watching who haven't seen Adam when he's being funny, Adam is incredibly funny and very good live funny. So you're out there doing that, making people laugh, and carrying that off while, you know, dealing with this. In there, you tell a story. You were doing an event, and there was somebody who had known you and David when you were younger, college, I guess, something like that. And you're sitting next to her at a dinner and dreading that she's going to ask you about David. And you talk about build up to it. And then she asks you about David finally. And what do you do?
I say something like, yeah, he's great. He lives with his wife in Brookline.
Why did you do that?
You know, there was in those initial months and really for many years, again, I wanted everyone to know what had happened because I wanted people to meet me knowing that, like, I wanted my friends to know. I wasn't trying to keep it a secret in any way, but I never wanted to be the person to tell anybody because it was very hard to say it. It was very hard to see the news register on another face. And also I was constantly around new people at this time. I was constantly doing these public things. I was constantly running into, people. This was a girl who I had no memory of, but she had booked me to come to a talk based on the fact partly that, like, oh, I know Adam from high school. And like, I knew that at some point she was going to ask about my brother. I was dreading it the entire meal, and in this period, I got really good at being able to steer a conversation away from family 5 minutes before the other person even knows that they're going to ask a question about family, like it just became, and then like, people, I went back to home to California after living away for 2 years, and I wasn't sure who had gotten the word. I had asked certain friends to make a bunch of phone calls, but I'd like run into sort of second tier friends and have this weird moment where I didn't know if they knew. I wasn't going to tell them. People don't know how to react anyway, so it's not like they were going to necessarily offer me condolences, even if they did know. All this kind of weird stuff, and then years after that, I get to a point where, and this is the case for me now, is like, if I meet somebody and I like them and I want them around, I have this urge to tell them, and I almost feel like I'm being dishonest until I tell them, and I look for a way to tell them, but often that way is not available. Like, it's not just some shit you say casually. It does. No other conversation naturally dovetails like into this, I love you dearly. And I never found an opportunity.
I was just going to say, I obviously didn't make the first tier of friendship because I didn't know until you asked me to do this.
Yeah.
That I didn't know.
Yeah. And I knew that your mother had killed herself. And but like, there were times when I was like, okay, we're on an early morning flight together, just me and Dave's. Why Bell's he's walking or something. And so like, this will be the time that I'll bring this up with Dave. And I just, it's like, to this day, I do it still very rarely. And I have to have the right, like lighting and shit. And this book sort of changes that. But
it's out there now. It's out there now.
Yeah.
Well, next time we meet, we'll hug that out.
Yeah.
Okay. You say in the book that your mom asked you not to write about David, and you did. Does she know? Yes, she knows. How does she react?
After I wrote the book and like sat with the book a bit, and a few folks read the book, my buddy Daniel Alarcon, who Mitch quoted earlier, who's also on the back of the book blurbing it because he's a novelist, my partner Jamie, a couple other people. After I had a sense from folks that the book was a book, and something that I should put out into the world, I wrote my parents an email telling them that I'd written the book and explaining that, I sort of always knew that I would, and that it was necessary and blah, blah, blah. And that I felt differently now. As I said, I started writing it around the time he would have turned 40, which is a hard day. The harder day is the anniversary of his death, which is about 5-6 weeks later. And I was done with the book by the time that day rolled around. And I felt differently. Like, I felt able to look that day in the eye in a way I never had before. Like, I wasn't dreading it the same way. I wasn't at loose ends. I didn't feel like whatever choice I made about how to spend it was wrong, which is always how I feel if I'm with people. If I'm not with people, I'm like, I fucked this up. And I put all this in the email, and they were incredibly supportive and understanding. Like, they kind of knew that I would write about David eventually. They were happy that they were happy that I felt the way I felt, that it had been cathartic for me in the way that it had. And then when they finally read it, it was kind of like more of the same. So, you know, my mother, a couple of times over the years, when some, you know, family thing happens, has like cornered me and been like, you better never write about this. The moment that I write about, also in the book, where my 95-year-old grandfather is having this delusion that a Massachusetts state law is going to kill him in the next 24 hours, is the other time I remember where she was like, I better not do this in print. And I'm always like, I never say yes. I'm always like, I'll do whatever. I'm a writer. God damn it. You know, this was the agreement that her mother, who was also a writer, made with her, that she would never write about her. I've never made any such agreement. But my parents have been great, and they've you know, when push comes to shove, they've only ever been extremely supportive of my work, unless I'm writing with Alan, in which case they have a lot of doubts about what I should be doing.
Okay, I just got to get this in because I don't want people to think this book is just a downer. It's actually, well, it's very uplifting in places. It's incredibly moving in places. It's also funny as shit in places. My favorite anecdote, would you just please tell people about how you came to rip the head off an MC Hammer?
Right. I forgot that.
And you know, what was the, you know, what was, why did you do that? Yeah.
Well, yeah. And thank you. Yeah. Weirdly enough, not weirdly, I mean, it makes perfect sense to me. And I think probably to you more than most people that there is a lot of humor in the book. Like, that's not a part of our brains that we just turn off. Like, humor is what gets us through everything, mostly tragedy. Right. So,
right.
And in the moments, if I hadn't had humor to fall back on, and the humor that's in the book is not stuff that I'm like superimposing at a later date. It's shit that I was thinking at the time. Like, there's a scene in the book where, you know, one of my few like religiously Christian friends like prays for me, where it's the day after my brother's death, and he's taken me to the airport, and he asks if he can pray for me. He puts his hands on my shoulders and starts making up this prayer, and it's baffling. It's batshit insane to me. And the line is something like, you know, in Judaism, that is called forgetting the words.
Yeah.
It wasn't like this was my thought at the time. Like, through the shock and the grief, I still was like, hey, you know what's funny is so like it's always there. The MC Hammer thing, when I was like 13, you know, I was a rapper and a DJ. You know, I still collect records. These are my records, folks. I have a lot of them. I was shopping at Tower Records in Boston, Back Bay Tower Records, the big flagship store. And guarding the rap section was a big life-size cardboard cutout of MC Hammer, who was, you know, not the most beloved figure by hardcore hip-hoppers at the time. He was considered something of a sellout. So I ripped the head off of the cardboard cutout of MC Hammer and stuffed it into my pocket, not in an act of theft as much as decapitation. I was like arrested by like Tower Record security, and they took me into the basement 3 levels down in the like deep dungeon beneath Tower Records. And I'll never forget, because they sat me down, and among other things, they told me that this cardboard cutout was worth $5,000. Utterly ridiculous. The reason it makes its way into the book is that I happened on this adventure to be with a kid that I didn't hang out with much. He was a friend from summer camp who I saw maybe once a year outside of summer camp. His name was Thad Ferber, which is an unforgettable name. And his father is Dr. Richard Ferber, the sleep guru, who I was co-hosting a fundraiser with in LA. Anyway, it makes more sense in the book.
I think that on the scale of in the legal statutes, decapitation is a more serious offense than theft. Just for the record, I think.
Also,
go ahead.
That I was banned for life from Tower Records, which I'm proud to say turns out to be their life, not mine, because Tower Records is now defunct, and I'm still feeling great.
You're still cooking. And you also in the book managed to, speaking of humor, there's a joke that you routinely tell when we talk about our Jewish books that we wrote together that you tell in the book. You slipped it in, and I was thrilled to see that. So thank you for just out of nowhere. It appears. Actually, there was a reason for it in the book. I won't ask you to tell the joke. Well, yes, I will. Tell the joke here.
Yeah, again, like these jokes. I mean, this is a joke I've told a lot on stage because to me it's incredibly emblematic of everything wonderful about Jewish humor. And half the Jews in the world hate the joke, which is also incredibly emblematic of the Jewish people. The joke is about a Jewish guy who moves in next door to Rockefeller, and he buys like a house just as big. He buys the same Cadillac, hires the same gardener to trim the hedges. And one day Rockefeller walks out of his house and looks over and says, "Hey, you think you're as good as me, don't you?" And the Jewish guy looks over and says, "I think I'm better than you." And Rockefeller is furious and demands to know why. How could such a thing be possible? And the Jewish guy's like, "Well, for one thing, I don't live next door to a Jew."
And for our younger viewers, Rockefeller is the name of a very wealthy person, kind of like Bill Gates, right? Or what's his name? Well, I don't know what the plan is. It is now we have reached the end of the hour. I thought I don't know what we're supposed to do now. I'm feeling, I could keep talking, but there's Mitchell. Perhaps he can tell us what to do.
We can't
Mitchell,
hear.
Mitchell, you're muted. I could read Mitchell's lips. He's saying, "A hurricane is approaching Miami. Please bring your pets inside." Okay. I don't know what Mitchell's trying to do here.
I wonder if,
Mitchell's saying you're a shanda for the goyim.
I'm sorry, everybody. Mitchell's mic is stuck, but I'm going to ask him to leave the studio and come back, and then we'll get started right again.
Wait.
Dave, we have to do this whole thing over.
What just happened?
Mitchell's gonna reconnect.
Oh, it's Mitchell's leaving.
Yeah. We're gonna stay right here.
This is entertainment.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. Sometimes the tech fails and his mic is stuck and I can't get it off.
It never fails. You know what technology is very dependable? Books.
That's right.
There he is. There he is.
Okay, I'm out.
All right, a couple of things. We were going to ask some questions, but we are running a little bit late. But I do want to remind people who are out there in the audience, there is a button you can click, and you absolutely must buy this book. I had a brother once, and you can buy it just by clicking that green button that's down there, and we would love you to do that. There were a few questions, Adam, that I think I will run through really quickly. Okay. As a very secular Jew who often goes back to the rituals of Judaism during times of grief, my question is, this is the questioner, did you find yourself feeling more connected to Jewish spiritual life after the death of your brother?
I think the answer is, in typical fashion, yes and no. There are moments when enacting certain rituals felt very hollow because I didn't have a history with them or a full understanding of them and how to really fully inhabit them. Like, there's a line in the book, I say something like, "We were sitting Shiva but did not know how. Instead of covering the mirrors, we became them."
Right.
Which is how I felt. Like, we were just staring at each other and crying and wailing, and there was no container for it. Like, that's what ritual ultimately provides, is a kind of container. You have 40 days to mourn. Your warranty is 30 days, whatever it is. And we were sort of dipping our toes into these things, but without a full understanding. So there were times when ritual felt hollow. There were times when I felt like if ritual is to mean anything, it's got to be ritual that I invent myself. which led me to question whether that is in fact even a ritual. But there were also moments where Jewish ritual was incredibly powerful for me. The scene that ends the book, not chronologically, but just the final scene in the book, is 1 year after my brother's death. I have a gathering at my house in California. Everybody is there. I did it really just because I didn't know how else to spend the day. And I was sick of wondering who knew and who didn't. So I just sent an email to everybody I knew in California and invited them over. And this older Jewish guy showed up with a prayer book and asked me if he wanted me to say the Kaddish, the mourner's Kaddish. And I was like, yes, please say it. And he said it, and he read it in front of everybody. We all stood in a circle and held hands. I don't know what those words mean, but they were incredibly powerful. The history of them, the way that they connected this death and this loss to every other loss that's ever been memorialized with those words tore me apart in a beautiful way.
And I think, actually the way you end the book is with that anecdote. And I think the last two lines are really the lines that answer so many of the questions that people have as to why you wrote this. Was there any sense of guilt? And you end it by saying, and you're talking to your brother, and you say, "You cannot leave entirely. I will not let you go." Right? And I think that is at root would you agree that was one of the reasons for this to begin with?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like those lines still make me a little teary. I definitely didn't get through the audiobook intact when I was trying to read that piece. Yes, and I knew those were the last lines when I wrote them. Like I didn't write past those lines. The whole time I was flying very much blind. I didn't know where this was going. I didn't know how long it was going to be. Part of me never wanted the book to end because it was so powerful for me to be writing it. And another part of me was like, this is not sustainable. I have to get to the end of this book. And when I wrote those lines, they felt like the ending to me. And I sort of I walked away,
And I think you speak to everybody who has suffered loss of any sort with those lines as well. And somebody actually asked, and I'm wondering myself, going through this experience, has it made you, or have you become aware of various ways that people who have suffered through something like this can find some comfort? Are there groups that were particularly helpful for you, or was there some coping mechanism that you used that others might be able to learn from?
I was not someone who availed myself of groups. I mean, they certainly exist. I think that for some they're certainly helpful. My parents went to. It's interesting. They're called suicide survivors groups, which the writer in me, my father's an editor, so I don't know how he managed to not comment on the paradoxical nature of a name like that. But I think that they found that helpful. I didn't attend those things. For the first year, I was literally on the road the entire year. So by the time that became sort of something I had the option to do, I didn't feel called to do that. I mean, for me, it was my community. It was my friends and my family. People really showed up for me and continue to show up for me. There were people who did incredible things that I'll never forget. That helped me through. From my friend Vinny, who when I was in Philly, I was about to pack up an entire house and drive it. He packed up my house and drove the truck up to Boston because I had to just fly to Boston and be with my family. There was a year, I think it was the second year after my brother's death, where I don't know, for some stupid fucking reason, I decided I would just spend the anniversary of his death alone in my house. And by 9 a.m., I realized that was a terrible idea. And it was a Tuesday. And I was calling people. My friend Shanaka was in Los Angeles. And she was like, I'll be on the next plane. Just pick me up at SFO. And we spent the day sneaking around a movie theater, watching dumb movies and then drinking bourbon. But she got on a plane to spend the day with me. I'll never forget that. A guy that I didn't even know that well, who was a writer and a friend of my parents and a mutual client of my agents who happened to live near my parents in Boston. Like, he just showed up a couple times. Mitch Zukoff showed up a couple times and just like took me out to lunch so I could get out of the relentlessness of like the grief in the house. You know, I'll never forget him for doing that. Very simple thing, but like that, you know, just that hour meant everything. The fact that he did that is, you know, he'll be in my will for that. You know what I mean? Like, so yeah, for me, it was my community that really like got me.
Well, I think if anything, this last year of all of us being isolated, you know, and hearing both you and Dave and knowing about your friendship and watching it and hearing this discussion, it makes us all realize that what it all boils down to is the sense of community, the sense of humanity that we all have for one another. And I can't tell you how grateful I am to both of you to be spending the day, the evening talking to you about something so meaningful and personal. And, you know, I love you both. And I hope one day we can, you know, after we can have an event like this and afterwards go hit a bar somewhere and continue the discussion. I look forward to it. Adam and Dave and all of you out there, please make sure you buy this book. I had a brother once. It's going to change the way you see things. So thank you both.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful, wonderful weekend. And until we see each other again.
Yes. Thank you. I love you guys. And I appreciate all of this.
Love you guys too.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.